Some foods taste really sour or tart, right? Whew. Yeah, that is tart. What you're actually tasting with the taste buds in your tongue is how many hydrogen ions are in there. They seem strange, but you're really sensing directly the acid. And the opposite of an acid is a base, but they both measure how much of this stuff is in the solution. And the amount of hydrogen ions has a really dramatic effect on the chemical environment of a cell or any other solution. And our bodies are really sensitive to even small changes in how much of this stuff is in solution. When we measure hydrogen ions, we're measuring the pH of a solution, which is a strange scale that we'll get used to a little bit in this video. Pretty much all parts of our body are mostly water. And so when we talk about pH, we're measuring how much of that water dissociates or breaks up into hydrogen and hydroxide ions. It's not much. This is chemical equilibrium, so most of the water is water. But some of it, a really small amount, breaks up into these guys, and the pH measures how much of this is in solution. Let's take a closer look at this on the big screen. So let's kind of assume that this blue background just represents water. So there's tons and tons of water molecules, some of which have split up into the hydroxide and hydrogen ions. If there's an equal number of these, then we say that the pH is right here at 7. That's neutral. That's when the amount of hydroxide and hydrogen ions equal one another. And usually we like neutral. That's a pretty comfortable place for most biological organisms. On the other hand, if we were to add an acid, we would be adding lots more hydrogen ions, and that would cause the pH to go down. The more hydrogen ions we add, the further down that number would go. Doesn't make intuitive sense, but that's how the pH scale works. What about a base? If we were to add something that put a bunch of hydroxide ions in solution, then the pH of the solution goes up. You know what I still don't quite get is, what is the difference between acidic and acid? Good question, Squelchuck. Acidic and basic refer to the nature of the solution. What is that watery solution like? Where an acid or a base is a physical chemical, something like hydrochloric acid that you could sprinkle into a solution and change the chemical nature. So if you add an acid, then the solution becomes acidic. Well, let's look at several of them, like hydrochloric acid, which breaks up into hydrogen ions and chloride ions, obviously this changing the pH. But there's a whole variety of acids and bases, some of them strong, some of them weak. Let's take a look. All right, so here we have a bunch of examples. I know, it's a lot of chemistry for one screen. Let's break it down. On the left here, in green, we have the acids. On the right, in purple, we have the bases. And they range from strong at the top to weaker down here at the base. Let's take this first one, hydrochloric acid. So this ionic compound is hydrochloric acid. When we put it into solution, it breaks up and gives us lots of hydrogen ions, changing the pH pretty dramatically. And I've symbolized this with a really strong right arrow, indicating that when we put this in solution, it pretty much all breaks up, and so every one of these that goes in, we get one of these that comes out. So it has a dramatic effect. Let's look at this next one. This is acetic acid, the one that gives us vinegar. You'll notice it's a very different molecule. It's not an ionic compound. This one is a molecule with the hydrogen ion over here that can be given up. Now sometimes that bond here will remain intact, and so the hydrogen ion stays, and sometimes it won't. And so I've indicated that with this shorter arrow to the right, saying that only some of it breaks up into hydrogen ions, and some of it doesn't. more of it tends to remain over here. So even though we might dump a bunch of vinegar in solution, not all of it gives us hydrogen ions. So that's a bit of a weaker acid. This one down here is carbonic acid. This is an important one formed when carbon dioxide dissolves in water. Same sort of thing is this bond down here that can break to give up a hydrogen ion. And when it does, it actually forms this base over here, the bicarbonate ion. And of course, a little bit of that hydrogen ion. But since not a lot of it breaks up, then it's a really weak acid. All right, what about the bases? Let's start with sodium hydroxide. This is another ionic compound. So it breaks up into the sodium ion and the hydroxide ion. If we add a lot of this to solution, then the pH changes dramatically in the upward direction. The pH goes up, right? It becomes less acidic, more basic. We can change the pH in ways other than adding hydroxide ions. We can also absorb hydrogen ions. And so this molecule here is ammonia. It can accept a hydrogen ion and become NH4. So when it does that, it decreases the amount of hydrogen ions in solution, bringing the pH up, right? Making it more basic. And that brings us back to bicarbonate, kind of a weak base. If we add hydrogen ions to solution, it can absorb them and drive that reaction back the other way to form carbonic acid and therefore raise the pH of the solution. So there's several examples. Main point being strong acids and bases. For every one molecule you add to solution, you get a big change. The weaker ones down here don't tend to be as reactive and make less of a contribution to the change of pH of a solution. Let's take a closer look at pH, which is measuring the concentration of this ion. So here's a really simple representation of the pH scale, which we know measures the hydrogen ion concentration. So over on this end, we have lots of hydrogen ions, lots of them. And so that would be things like stomach acid, which has a very low pH, lots of hydrogen ions. And over here, there is a low amount of hydrogen ions and relatively more hydroxide ions. But pH is really just the measure of the hydrogen ions themselves. And one weird thing is it's a logarithmic scale or a log scale. And we just do this to help us make sense of really big numbers. Let me show you what I mean. Here is the hydrogen ion concentration. It is enormous up here at pH of 0. And so this has 1 mole of hydrogen ions for every liter of water. Now, a mole is like a dozen with a lot of zeros after it. So it's just this really big number. And by the time we get down to 7, then we have not just 7 times fewer hydrogen ions, but one with 7 zeros times less. So 1/10,000,000th of the concentration. And by the time we get out here to 14, we have 1 mole of hydrogen ions in something like 100 trillion liters of water. That's 400 times filling up Rimrock Lake. The pH scale spans a huge range of hydrogen ion concentrations from one end to the other. And we don't think naturally of numbers with too many zeros. We can handle things 1 to 100, but 0 to 14 works out okay, and it helps us communicate a really large range of numbers in a pretty small numerical span. That's why the pH scale is arranged this way. Well, there's acids and bases, a really important chemical concept in the body because it affects the environment so dramatically. We spend a lot of energy regulating the pH within our body. On the topic of pH, it's a really strange measurement scale. It's not really intuitive. Therefore, I recommend that you pause and think a couple of moments before you answer a question about them. It's too easy to get those backwards. It doesn't make sense that increasing hydrogen ions decreases pH. It's just something you gotta wrestle with. But it is what it is. That's it for this time. Until next time, when life gives you lemons, measure the pH.